June 12, 1944, 900 a.m. Across occupied France, the voice of Berlin radio crackled through battered sets in farmhouses and bunkers alike. The words came sharp, designed to cut deep. The American is soft. He cannot endure the hardship of war. It was not the first time German listeners had heard such declarations. From the earliest days of the conflict, Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda hammered a single theme. The soldiers of the United States were spoiled products of a decadent society, incapable of matching the grit of the Wehrmacht. Posters, pamphlets, and broadcasts painted the picture in lurid tones. The German public was told that their enemies were pampered men who had grown up with too much milk, too much sugar, too many machines that did the work for them. They were mechanized weaklings, the story went, completely reliant on their factories and factories alone. Without their endless supply lines, without their canned food and cigarettes, the Americans would crumple like paper. The German soldier, hardened on the Russian front and tempered in years of total war, was said to be the true heir of ancient warriors. The American was a boy playing at soldiering. In caricatures that circulated among Wehrmacht troops, the image of the GI was almost comical. He was drawn with gum perpetually stuck in his cheek, one hand holding a chocolate bar, the other fumbling with a rifle. His pack bulged with unnecessary items, razors, spare socks, tins of coffee, even baseball gloves. These cartoons contrasted with the lean, angular depiction of the German infantryman, standing like a steel tower under the Reich's eagle standard. To German audiences, it was meant to reinforce pride. To the men at the front, it was meant to reassure them that the enemy was weak, laughable, and unprepared for the brutalities of a true war. Radio broadcasts drove the point home with sneering certainty. Announcers mocked the very idea of citizen soldiers drawn from farms and city streets. They ridiculed the notion of men who had never known hunger or cold suddenly being thrust into Europe's blood-soaked fields. "They will tire after a week," one German broadcaster declared confidently. "They will cry for their mothers before they reach the Seine." Others claimed that American soldiers were so dependent on their endless convoys of supplies that if cut off from cigarettes or coffee, they would abandon their rifles and surrender. The effect was double-edged. For Germans, it was intended to inspire contempt for their new enemy and steel their resolve. For Americans who sometimes intercepted these broadcasts, it was a challenge, a bitter insult hurled across the airwaves. The GIs who landed in Normandy knew full well that they were being mocked as soft boys with weak spines. They carried that knowledge into the mud and smoke of the hedgerows, where there was no room for weakness, only survival. What Goebbels and his propagandists never understood was that the very things they mocked, the chewing gum, the chocolate, the small luxuries tucked away in rucksacks, were not symbols of weakness. They were tokens of home, reminders of what was waiting across the Atlantic, and in many cases, a source of resilience. A stick of gum could calm nerves before a firefight. A chocolate bar shared among foxholes could lift spirits in the rain. Where the German propagandists saw softness, the GI saw a reason to keep moving forward. As the weeks of June wore on, the German narrative of weakness would be tested in the fields and villages of France. The Bocage country, with its ancient hedgerows and narrow lanes, became a proving ground. German veterans who had scoffed at the idea of facing Americans would soon find themselves fighting men who might have once been farm hands, clerks, or mechanics, men who carried no illusions of glory. Only the stubborn will to live and see their friends live too. The radio had called them soft. The propaganda machine had laughed at their chewing gum and their bulging packs. But in the summer of 1944, as the hedgerows of Normandy turned into killing fields, the so-called soft soldiers would reveal a toughness no broadcast could dismiss, a relentless spirit that would grind down even the most battle-hardened Wehrmacht divisions. They were not born soldiers. When America went to war, its armies were not drawn from a professional class of warriors, but from the ordinary fabric of civilian life. In Iowa, boys who had grown up milking cows before dawn traded pitchforks for rifles. In Detroit, grease-stained mechanics who had once bent over car engines now studied the workings of a Browning automatic rifle. Clerks from New York skyscrapers, who had shuffled papers in crowded offices, learned to march in rhythm across parade fields. From Oregon came lumberjacks, muscles hardened from felling trees, who discovered that the weight of an M1 Garand was nothing compared to the grind of an axe. Across the nation, shopkeepers, coal miners, college students, and schoolteachers were all called into uniforms that hung loose on the first day, but would be worn like a second skin by the time they crossed the Atlantic. The American soldier was a citizen first, and that reality shaped the character of the force. Unlike Germany's Wehrmacht, built on years of militaristic tradition and indoctrination, the U.S. Army in 1941 was tiny and inexperienced. The draft changed that almost overnight. Millions of men poured into camps with little more than a letter from the draft board in their pockets and a suitcase from home. They arrived unsure, sometimes reluctant, often bewildered. But within weeks, the rough edges of civilian life began to grind against the strict order of military training. Training camps stretched across the United States, from the pine barrens of New Jersey to the deserts of California. Reveille blasted before dawn, dragging men from wooden bunks into the morning chill. Basic training hammered civilians into soldiers through endless drills, marching until blisters bled, running obstacle courses under live fire, learning to dig foxholes in rocky soil. Rifle marksmanship became a ritual, the crack of the M1 echoing across fields as instructors barked corrections. Men who had never held a weapon became steady shots, taught to trust the 8-round clip and the sturdy walnut stock pressed to their shoulder. Physical conditioning was relentless. Long runs with full packs toughened legs unused to marching 20 miles in a day. Bayonet training was crude and brutal, instructors shouting, "Kill, kill, kill!" as recruits thrust into stuffed sacks. There was no mistaking the message. Softness would not be tolerated. The Army demanded discipline, and while American training never reached the rigid extremes of the Wehrmacht, it produced men who could endure discomfort, push through fatigue, and rely on one another when the test came. Field maneuvers tested those lessons under harsher conditions. Recruits were marched into muddy woods or barren deserts, ordered to establish camps, conduct mock assaults, and survive for days on sea rations. It was during these exercises that clerks and farm boys learned that survival depended not only on themselves, but on the man beside them. Camaraderie, born of shared misery, replaced the anonymity of civilian life. By the time a division shipped overseas, it had fused into something the Germans could not quantify with propaganda, a collective will forged out of ordinary men. Motivation for the American GI was rarely ideological. Few quoted Roosevelt or talked of democracy between foxholes. They fought for simpler, harder reasons. Duty pressed them forward, the draft card in their pocket, the expectation of their families back home. For many, survival was motivation enough. Kill or be killed. Fight today to see tomorrow. And perhaps strongest of all was comradeship. In the mud of a French trench or the snow of the Ardennes, a GI fought not for abstract ideals, but for the friend crouched beside him. Bonds formed in training, sharing cigarettes on night watch, swapping stories about home, became the invisible glue that held units together under fire. A man would risk his life for his buddy, and that was something no propaganda could dismiss. Their weapons and gear became both burden and lifeline. The M1 Garand was the heart of the American infantryman's kit, a semi-automatic rifle that gave him a crucial edge in firepower. Each pull of the trigger sent another round downrange without the need to work a bolt. German soldiers mocked American reliance on machines, but on the battlefield, the Garand's 8 rounds could pour out faster than the Morser's 5. The Thompson submachine gun, heavy and unwieldy, sprayed bullets in close combat, while the BAR gave squads the base of fire needed to suppress enemies in hedgerows and rubble. Every man wore the steel M1 helmet, a clumsy bowl that nonetheless saved lives from shrapnel and debris. Strapped to belts were entrenching tools, short-handled shovels used to dig foxholes in rain-soaked soil or frozen ground. Packs carried extra socks, spare clips, grenades, sometimes a photograph of a wife or sweetheart folded into a Bible. Cigarettes and gum were passed around like currency, small comforts that mattered more than the German propagandist could imagine. Contrary to Nazi claims of luxury, the American soldier's reality was far from easy. Mud caked boots, rations came cold, nights were sleepless. Sea rations, packed in tin cans, offered beans, meat, or stew that tasted like cardboard after weeks in the field. Chocolate melted in the heat of a helmet, cigarettes ran out, socks stayed wet for days. Lice, frostbite, and trench foot stalked the ranks as surely as German bullets. If there was luxury, it was found only in brief respites, a hot shower in a commandeered farmhouse, or a letter from home that arrived miraculously intact. To the Germans, the GI appeared as a boy weighed down by too much gear and too many comforts. To those who marched the endless miles, that gear was survival. The Garand was not a luxury but a necessity. The helmet, the shovel, the spare socks, each item earned its weight in the brutal reality of combat. What German propaganda mistook for softness was in truth preparation, an understanding that war was not a matter of pride or ideology, but of endurance. By the time these men set foot on French soil, they were no longer just farm boys and mechanics. Training had not erased their civilian roots, but it had tempered them into something far more dangerous than the Germans expected, adaptable, determined, and armed with a quiet resilience. They did not shout slogans or march with theatrical precision. Instead, they carried the grit of everyday America into a continent torn apart by war, ready to prove that the so-called soft soldier could endure anything Europe's battlefields would throw against him. By the second week of June 1944, the beaches of Normandy were secure, but the fight for France was only beginning. The world had seen the photographs of D-Day American infantry clawing their way up sand and shingle under the storm of machine gun fire. Yet for the men who survived that day, the greater trial lay inland, just a few miles beyond the shoreline. What awaited them was a battlefield unlike anything their training grounds back home had prepared them for. A countryside both deceptively beautiful and lethally designed for defense. Normandy was not open farmland where armies could maneuver freely. It was bocage country, a patchwork of small fields divided by thick, ancient hedgerows. Each hedgerow was more than just a line of brush. They were centuries-old earth embankments, built high and crowned with tangled roots, brambles, and trees that rose 10 to 15 feet above the lanes. To a farmer, they were boundaries and windbreaks. To a defender, they were fortresses. For the Americans pushing inland, every hedgerow became a wall concealing rifles, machine guns, and mortars. The Germans understood the blockade better than their enemies. They had spent months preparing firing positions in the tangled hedges, digging foxholes into the banks, camouflaging 88 guns in the trees. A single squad of well-trained Germans could turn a field into a killing ground. American units advancing through one gap often found themselves raked by fire from three sides. Tanks that tried to push through the hedgerows became stuck, their bellies exposed, their crews slaughtered. Infantrymen, forced to crawl on their bellies through the wet earth, often discovered the enemy only when muzzle flashes erupted a few feet away. Losses mounted quickly. The optimism of the beach landings gave way to grim attrition. Casualties in some battalions reached staggering numbers within days. Commanders wrote home that the blockade was worse than anything faced in training, worse even than the trench systems studied from the First World War. Soldiers who had expected rapid advances toward Paris found themselves gaining only a few yards in a day, and sometimes losing them again at nightfall. Yet the Americans adapted because they had no choice. Ingenuity became their weapon. Engineers and tank crews began experimenting with ways to force their Shermans through the hedgerows. One solution came from Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. Using scrap steel from a destroyed German roadblock, he welded sharp prongs like giant tusks to the front of a Sherman. The device allowed the tank to punch directly through the earthen walls rather than climb over them. These rhino tanks, as the soldiers called them, broke the stalemate. Soon hundreds of Shermans were fitted with the hedgerow cutters, turning what had seemed impenetrable into something that could be overcome with brute force and steel. But tanks alone could not solve the problem. American units learned to fight as combined teams, infantry, armor, and artillery working in concert. Artillery was brought forward in creeping barrages, pounding suspected German positions before each advance. Infantry squads infiltrated hedgerows under cover of smoke, grenades primed and rifles ready. Coordinated signals, whistles, colored flares, even shouted passwords kept the chaos under control. Slowly, painfully, the doctrine of fire and maneuver took root among men who had, just months before, been civilians. The struggle for St. Lo illustrated the price of progress. The 29th Infantry Division, already bloodied at Omaha Beach, found itself advancing yard by yard through the blockade in July. Day after day, they attacked small German strongpoints, often at the cost of entire squads. At night, they dug into muddy fields, sharing foxholes with the stench of unwashed bodies and rotting cattle killed by artillery. Sleep came in snatches, broken by flares and sudden bursts of machine gun fire. Men rotated forward and back, but even in rear areas there was little rest. The hedgerows seemed to swallow them whole. Private accounts tell of men crawling through fields on hands and knees, rifles clutched tight, ears straining for the clink of a German bolt. One GI remembered pressing his cheek into the earth, heart hammering as bullets snapped overhead and dirt spattered across his helmet. Another described the sheer exhaustion, the weight of the gerund, the mud caking boots, the constant fear that each rustle in the hedges meant an ambush. The propaganda had called them soft, but in Normandy's hedgerows, only stubbornness and endurance kept them alive. In the 4th Infantry Division, men fought through similar nightmares south of Cairnton. German paratroopers, veterans of the Eastern Front, used every trick to bleed the Americans. They fired Panzerfausts at Shermans, laid mines in the narrow lanes, and sniped from hidden holes. The GIs responded with equal determination. Squads learned to assault each hedgerow systematically, one team laying down fire, another crawling forward with grenades, a third ready to storm through the breach once the explosion cleared. Progress was measured not in miles but in hedgerows taken, one after another, at terrible cost. Even the landscape itself seemed against them. Rain turned the fields into mud, clogging boots and soaking uniforms. The air smelled of manure and cordite, of damp earth mixed with blood. Fields were littered with broken equipment, burned-out vehicles, and the bodies of men who had fallen yards from safety. Flies gathered in swarms, and medics worked frantically in ditches to save the wounded, often under fire themselves. Still, the advance continued. For every German ambush, the Americans developed a counter. For every hedgerow turned into a fortress, they found a way to breach it. Their progress was slow, brutal, and costly, but it was relentless. In the end, the Bocage country that had seemed impenetrable yielded, not because of overwhelming firepower alone, but because ordinary GIs refused to stop. When Saint-Lô finally fell, the town was reduced to rubble. Streets were unrecognizable, buildings reduced to shattered walls. The 29th Division had lost thousands of men, but they had taken their objective. German soldiers who had once sneered at the soft Americans now knew better. They had seen these farm boys, clerks, and mechanics fight through hell itself, and still keep coming. In Normandy's hedgerows, the myth of the weak GI began to die. The Germans had mocked the gum-chewing, chocolate-eating soldier as a pampered amateur. But those same men, crawling through mud and blood, adapting with every step, showed a resilience no propaganda could erase. What the Reich called softness was, in truth, resourcefulness, and it was grinding the Wehrmacht down, one field at a time. By the autumn of 1944, the Germans had been pushed back across France, but their spirit was unbroken. Hitler ordered his armies to fight on the defensive, buying time, bleeding the Allies wherever possible. For the Americans, the next crucible was not the open plains they had imagined, but a dark, endless wall of pine and fir, the Huetjen forest. To the Germans, it was perfect ground. To the GIs, it was hell. The Huetjen lay along the German border, thick with towering evergreens that blotted out the sun. The canopy trapped the damp and cold, turning the forest into a place where light itself felt rationed. Trails twisted into endless tangles of mud, and the soil soaked up rain until foxholes collapsed into pools. The forest floor, blanketed with pine needles, muffled footsteps but also concealed mines and tripwires. German artillery crews had zeroed in on every path, every ridge, every clearing. When the shells exploded among the trees, they shattered trunks into splinters. The fragments scythed downward, cutting men to pieces in what soldiers called tree bursts. No helmet could deflect shards of oak or pine driven into flesh at the speed of bullets. The men of the U.S. 4th Infantry Division entered the Huetjen in November. Their advance was measured in yards, not miles. Progress came at the cost of entire companies. Rain fell constantly, soaking uniforms and filling boots. Foxholes collapsed in the night, drowning the exhausted. Supplies were dragged forward by hand because vehicles bogged down in the swampy trails. Medics fought a losing battle against trench foot, pneumonia, and infection. The Germans, hunkered in fortified bunkers, believed that this was the battlefield that would break the so-called soft American. Yet the GIs did not falter. They rotated units, sending one regiment forward while another fell back to reorganize, then throwing them in again. Men returned to the same forest lines week after week, faces drawn, uniforms in tatters, but still willing to advance. Division after division passed through the Huitgen, the 4th, the 9th, the 28th, the 1st. Each was bloodied, battered, nearly broken, yet none surrendered the fight. One soldier later said, "We didn't conquer the Huitgen, we endured it." That endurance was precisely what German propaganda had denied Americans possessed. As winter deepened, the forest ordeal gave way to something even more shocking. In December 1944, the German army launched its last great offensive through the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler gambled that his divisions could smash through thin American lines, split the Allies in two, and force a negotiated peace. His generals assured him that American soldiers, untested in true winter warfare, would collapse once surrounded. "They are soft," the German High Command repeated. "They will not hold." The spear of the offensive fell on Bastogne, a Belgian town at the hub of 7 vital roads. Holding it meant denying the Germans their advance. Defending Bastogne were the men of the 101st Airborne Division, reinforced by elements of the 10th Armored Division and other scattered units. They had no winter clothing, only thin uniforms unsuited to snow and sub-zero cold. Supplies were short, ammunition scarcer still. By December 20, they were completely surrounded. The Germans believed they had them. They sent an ultimatum to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, demanding surrender. His reply was a single word that would pass into legend: nuts. The answer baffled the Germans, but electrified the Americans. It was a defiant gesture from men who were cold, hungry, and nearly out of shells, but utterly unwilling to yield. In the foxholes around Bastogne, GIs endured the cold with whatever scraps they could find. They wrapped themselves in tablecloths taken from abandoned houses, used gunny sacks for blankets, and stuffed newspapers into their jackets. Frostbite took its toll. Frost cracked lips and turned fingers black. Yet the lines held. When German tanks probed the perimeter, American bazooka teams braved open fields to knock them out. When artillery shells screamed overhead, men ducked into frozen holes, waited, then climbed out to return fire. "Soft," the Germans had said, but at Bastogne the Americans proved harder than the frozen earth they fought upon. On Christmas Day, when German troops tried to break through again, they were met with fierce resistance. Even without hot food or proper gear, the GIs would not let Bastogne fall. Then, on December 26, the siege broke. General Patton's Third Army thundered north, opening a corridor into the town. Relief convoys rolled in, bringing food, blankets, and ammunition. But it was the men already there, the frostbitten, sleepless, hungry soldiers of the 101st, who had preserved Bastogne and with it the Allied line. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest fight the U.S. Army ever faced. Nearly 80,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or captured. Entire units were shattered. Yet when the snow melted and the smoke cleared, the line had held. Hitler's gamble had failed. His armies had spent their last reserves in a bid to prove the Americans weak, and instead revealed their own exhaustion. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, watching the battle unfold, later spoke of what the ordinary GI had accomplished. He recognized that the war was not won by generals or grand strategy alone, but by the persistence of young men who fought on frozen ground with little more than grit and determination. "The truly heroic figure of this war is the American fighting man," he said, acknowledging the endurance of soldiers who had faced the worst conditions Europe could throw at them and emerged unbroken. From the damp misery of the Huitgen to the snow-choked foxholes of Bastogne, the myth of the soft American soldier disintegrated. They were not polished or parade ground perfect. They did not look like professional warriors, but they held the line when it mattered most, paying in blood and suffering to deny the enemy victory. In the winter forests of Europe, the so-called soft GI had proven himself harder than steel. By early 1945, the war had crossed its final frontier. The Germans had mocked the idea that American soldiers could sustain the pace, insisting they would falter before reaching the fatherland. Yet the Rhine, that fabled river that had stood for centuries as a shield of Germany, was about to be crossed. For months, Allied commanders had debated how best to breach the Rhine's wide waters, defended by bunkers, artillery, and the wreckage of destroyed bridges. The Germans boasted that no soft American could force such a crossing under fire. But in March, the 9th Armored Division seized the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, still standing despite German demolition charges. Word spread like wildfire: the Americans were across the Rhine. Engineers worked frantically under shell fire to reinforce the bridge, laying pontoons and ferries while infantry streamed over. The crossing shattered Hitler's last illusion that the river was impassable. What followed was no rapid dash into the heart of Germany, but a grinding campaign through ruined towns and cities. Aachen had already fallen in October 1944 after brutal street fighting, the first major German city taken by the Allies. Its rubble was a grim preview of what awaited. Cologne, Düsseldorf, and countless smaller towns became battlefields where every street corner, cellar, and shattered building offered cover for defenders. The GIs found themselves in landscapes that looked less like towns than like mazes of brick and stone, filled with death at every turn. Street fighting was unlike anything they had trained for. Tanks rumbled down narrow boulevards, their turrets swiveling at every window. Infantry moved in squads, clearing buildings room by room with grenades and bayonets. Snipers lurked in rafters, firing from holes blasted into walls. SS troops fought with fanatical resolve, some refusing to surrender even when surrounded. Civilians cowered in basements, caught between shells and small arms fire. For the GIs, the challenge was not just defeating the enemy, but staying alive in a world of rubble and shadows. In Cologne, the battle came to symbolize the shift in perception. German propaganda had painted the Americans as clumsy amateurs, incapable of matching the precision of the Wehrmacht. But here were 19- and 20-year-olds methodically advancing through streets, littered with wreckage, improvising tactics as they went. Squads learned to move in leapfrogging patterns, one covering, another advancing, then switching again. Bazooka teams hunted snipers in clock towers. Engineers blasted holes through walls so troops could pass from house to house without exposing themselves in the open. Civilians, too, began to notice. For years, they had been told Americans would crumble at the first sign of hardship. Now they watched men in mud-stained uniforms, faces gaunt from exhaustion, press on with relentless determination. They chewed gum, yes, and carried chocolate bars in their pockets. But they also carried rifles, grenades, and the will to push forward no matter how many walls stood in their way. The image of the soft GI dissolved amid the smoke and dust of Germany's collapsing cities. At Remagen, Sergeant Clarence Ridge of the 9th Armored Division recalled the chaos of crossing the bridge. German shells struck constantly, shaking the steel structure until bolts screamed and girders twisted. Men crawled forward on hands and knees, clutching rifles and packs, expecting the entire span to collapse beneath them. We were hungry, wet, and scared out of our skins, Ridge remembered later. But we went because the guy in front went, and the guy behind was counting on me to move. Once across, they dug into the eastern bank, fighting off counterattacks until engineers secured the crossing. Another GI, Private James McNeil, described entering Cologne after days without real rest. "We hadn't eaten more than a handful of rations in 2 days," he said. "Our boots were worn through. But the orders came to clear another block, so we cleared it. You didn't think about being tired anymore, you just thought about staying alive." He remembered watching the cathedral spires loom above the ruins, still standing though everything around them lay in rubble. It felt like the whole world had been smashed to pieces, but we were still there, moving forward. For German civilians, encounters with these exhausted, determined young men often overturned years of indoctrination. Some had expected cruelty and collapse. Instead, they saw soldiers who shared their rations with hungry children, who improvised solutions to problems rather than giving up, who kept advancing no matter how fierce the resistance. For German troops, the realization was harsher. Captured officers admitted they had underestimated the Americans. "We thought you were weak," one Wehrmacht lieutenant told his captors, "but you fight like bulldogs, you don't stop." By the time Cologne fell in March 1945, the myth of the soft GI was dead. The Rhine had been crossed, the cities of Germany were burning, and the boys whom propaganda had dismissed as untrained and spoiled were now seasoned veterans who had clawed their way across half a continent. They were thin, many carried scars, some limped from old wounds, but they were still in the fight, relentless, adaptive, and unstoppable. For all the propaganda that mocked their gum, their cigarettes, and their chocolate bars, it was those same men who now stood inside the ruins of Hitler's cities, driving the Reich toward its final collapse. The reality could no longer be denied. The American GI was not soft. He was the blunt, stubborn instrument of victory, and he would not stop until the war was finished. By the spring of 1945, the Reich lay in ruins. Cities that had once echoed with triumphant propaganda now smoldered, their streets filled with rubble and silence. For years, German broadcasts had mocked the Americans as unfit for war, boys masquerading as soldiers. Yet as columns of weary GIs pushed deeper into the heart of Germany, even hardened Wehrmacht officers were forced to admit that the propaganda had been a lie. Captured after the fall of the Ruhr Pocket, some officers expressed disbelief at what they had seen. "We were told you would break," one colonel confessed, "but you did not. You just kept coming with more men, more fire, more determination than we thought possible." The American soldier had not conquered by ideology or indoctrination. Unlike the fanatical SS or the drilled precision of the Wehrmacht, the GI's strength came from somewhere simpler, almost ordinary comradeship. He fought not because he believed in racial theories or territorial conquest, but because the man in the foxhole beside him needed him. War stripped away abstractions. In the chaos of artillery barrages, in the mud of the Huitgen or the snow of Bastogne, it was the bond between soldiers that kept units together. A GI would risk his life to pull a wounded buddy back to safety, share his last cigarette in a freezing hole, or give away a ration chocolate bar to a friend who hadn't eaten. The German propagandists had sneered at these small tokens of comfort, but they were the very fuel of resilience. That resilience had shattered the image painted by Goebbels' machine. The gum-chewing American in caricatures had turned out to be an improviser, quick to adapt, quick to find a way forward. The soldier, weighed down with luxuries, proved capable of enduring mud, hunger, and cold without surrendering the fight. Where German propaganda described dependence, the reality was ingenuity. Shermans were refitted with steel prongs to break hedgerows. Rifle squads invented new tactics for street fighting in Cologne. Paratroopers surrounded at Bastogne held out on scraps of food and sheer stubbornness. In every test, the Americans had shown themselves to be more than what the enemy imagined. For the civilians of Europe, the image of the GI became something different from either propaganda or myth. To the liberated French, he was the man who handed out chewing gum and candy to children in bombed-out villages. To the Belgians of Bastogne, he was the frostbitten young paratrooper who refused to surrender. To the Germans themselves, he was both conqueror and, sometimes unexpectedly, protector, sharing rations with starving families even after fierce battles. The soft soldier, far from crumbling, had revealed a kind of quiet strength that no pamphlet or broadcast could erase. By war's end, the GI was not seen as spoiled or amateur. He was the face of endurance, the embodiment of adaptability. He had crossed beaches under machine gun fire, clawed through hedgerows one field at a time, endured the nightmare forests and the frozen foxholes, and fought through the rubble of cities that no longer resembled cities at all. His uniform was wrinkled, his helmet dented, his boots often soaked through. But his will was iron. Generals and commanders, reflecting afterward, gave their share of credit to logistics, to industry, to numbers. But Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces, understood the deeper truth. Victory in Europe rested on the shoulders of millions of ordinary young men who had come from farms, factories, and classrooms, who bore no illusions of glory yet carried the weight of the war with unshakable resolve. In the end, the German propaganda machine had failed in its most basic task. It had underestimated the ordinary American, mistaking lack of polish for lack of grit. History revealed the opposite. The GI was not the brittle figure portrayed in posters and radio broadcasts. He was relentless in advance, stubborn in defense, and willing to endure every hardship so long as his comrades endured beside him. They called him soft. History called him relentless.